Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where we discuss international affairs. I'm Martin Zupko. There is a lot of happening regarding North Korea on two fronts. First, restrictive measures and provocations have been taken against South Korea. And the second, there are some reports that North Korean soldiers are joining Russian forces in the war in Ukraine. However, propaganda is a powerful tool during wartime. Therefore, we should approach these claims with critical thinking, relying on the facts we know, on the knowledge, experience, and assumptions we can make based on that. Therefore, my guest today is Yangmo Ku. Hello?
Hi, Martin. Thank you for the invitation.
Yangmo Ku is the chair of the History and Political Science Department and associate professor of political science at the Norwich University in the United States. He also serves as the Associate Director of the Peace and War Center, Norwich, and as the editor of the Journal of Peace and War Studies. Ku's research focuses on North and South Korean politics, East Asia, also US foreign policy, and politics of memory and reconciliation in East Asia and Europe. There is a very interesting book that I would recommend. It's titled Politics in North and South Korea, Political Development, Economy and Foreign Relations, where Professor Ku is a co-author. So this might be very interesting reading for our viewers. Let's start with the first question, and this question will start our discussion about the North Korea. And we know about incident, or we know about the development of some sort of provocations taken by the North Korea, and one of that is that they cut off land connections with South Korea. So how this decision by North Korean leader will or is impacting the strategic balance on the Korean peninsula?
Thank you for the question. So in addressing that topic, I think we need to understand domestic condition of North Korean society of like a recent period, especially. As we know, the 2018 and 2019, North Korea and South Korea and the United States, even China, they had very just optimistic kind of unfolding of summit diplomacy we witnessed. So US President Trump and Kim Jong-un met together. Even before then, the South Korean President Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un met at the Panmunjom. So like at the time, like in 2017, North Korea and United States had a big kind of security crisis, nuclear crisis, as we witnessed. But in 2018-19, the summit diplomacy happened. I think the South Korean President Moon Jae-in's role was very important at that time as a mediator. But what I'm trying to say is that that kind of summit diplomacy suddenly ended in February 2019 as the failure of Hanoi summit between President Trump and Chairman Kim Jong-un. So that I think North Korea almost lost its hope to make a nuclear deal with the United States, so that they were really just hoped to have sanction relief. But that didn't happen. So, and then 2020, as we witnessed, the pandemic hit the global society, and North Korea voluntarily shut its border in January 2020. So economically, I think North Korea was under very severe condition and dire condition. So until I think February 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, still North Korea had some hope to resume its diplomatic overture and diplomatic negotiations with the United States to get some sanctions relief and all those the points. But after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think North Korea's calculation of all those nuclear negotiations and future kind of prospects for regime survival and everything changed dramatically. So that the North Korea relied on the Russia as well as China as much as possible for its regime survival, rather than resorting to diplomatic negotiations with the United States and South Korea. So what I'm trying to say is that since that time on, anyway, North Korean economy was really under severe condition. Natural disasters hit North Korea, and the sanction regime continued. And so that especially a lot of like a South Korean cultural kind of component sneaked into North Korean society. So what I'm trying to say is that why North Korea suddenly tried to create this two-state doctrine, and they began considering South Korea as a belligerent state and all those components, because I think the North Korea tried to tighten its grips over North Korean people because, as I just mentioned, due to the inflow of South Korean cultural aspect and all those components, the North Korean people, they just tended to desire, or just they tended to expect some kind of the unification in favor of the South Korea. So I think the North Korean society tried to prevent North Korean people from having that kind of like aspirations for the desires for South Korean society and culture and economy and all those kind of stuff. So that I think North Korea tried to just explode all those railways and the roads that were built between those two Koreas of the past 5 to 6 years period. So I think I need to explain what kind of impact that has. So big concern is that the North Korea, right, under the condition that it is really difficult to have diplomatic negotiations with the US and South Korea. It is really difficult to have sanction reliefs. So the North Korea really rely on the China and Russia for their regime survival. So that I think it's a really difficult situation or dangerous situation if something like unintended military skirmishes and conflicts take place on North Korean Peninsula. I think because of these kind of gestures, North Korea can have just justification to take military actions against South Korea. So over a long period of time, North Korean leaders, they considered South Korea as a part of same people. So South Korea has been the subject of just handling the unification or achieving unification between the two Koreas. But right now, North Korea considers South Korea as an enemy state and adversary state. So they kind of, they had some justification for them to have some military action against South Korea if something just unfavorable to North Korea happens on that situation. So I think I explained a long kind of historical component about that, but it's very important to understand the kind of historical context of this current situation.
Absolutely. And if I may add a few remarks, I think it's very important to explain that in South Korea and North Korea, the symbolism is very strong. Mm-hmm. So this is also something we should consider when they cut off the road or rail or some sort of symbolic action is taken. Mm-hmm. That's a very strong message. It must be understood properly. Otherwise, we are oscillating around some sort of information that it's not 100%. We had a sort of concept of peaceful reunification, and now we have South Korea viewing as a primary foe. How is this changing the opinion about South and North Korea in terms of one day having one country, one peaceful country, especially in the society, how people think about it?
Yes, I think I want to respond to the questions in two ways. So within North Korean society and also within the South Korean society. So within North Korean society first, as I mentioned that the North Korean leaders, Kim Jong-un, try to eliminate North Korean people's desire or just the North Korean people's aspirations for like a peaceful unification with the South Korea. As I said, a lot of like the South Korean influence, South Korean cultural and economic influence in the North Korean society is very, I think, seemingly very dangerous to North Korean leaders in terms of maintaining it's a dictatorship, right? So many because of the inflowing information about the South Korean society and its economic affluence and a cultural kind of development and all those things, so that a lot of North Korean people they desire or they have a favorable feelings toward South Korea, so that the even just the North Korean the government enacted very strict laws to ban North Korean people from the consuming South Korean dramas and South Korean the musics and all those things. So when people are caught by disputing those items to the North Korean people, they are just have a very strict kind of punishment they have. So even just they were executed because of that. So what I'm saying is that the North Korean the regime, North Korean leaders try to eliminate North Korean people's kind of nostalgia for South Korean society and future unification. So that I think it's a very, from the North Korean people's perspective, it's very complicated. Over a long period of time, under the rule of Kim Il-sung, founding father of North Korea, and his son Kim Jong-il, over a long period of time, the unification was a very important policy focus of the North Korean society. But right now, I think Kim Jong-un tried to eliminate that. So I think North Korean people are very confused with this kind of message taking place within North Korean regime. In the case of South Korean society, as you may know, the younger generation of South Korean people, they have lost their desire to achieve unification with North Korea because of economic burden and just of the past 7 decades, they got separated. They didn't have many exchanges, so that many younger generations, especially also very rich people, they don't have any kind of motivations to pursue unification with the North Korea. So that I think this kind of North Korea's gestures that dampen South Korean peoples to pursue and seek peaceful unification with North Korea. So that I think it's a really just a unhelpful kind of trend we are witnessing.
Just one question about the young generation, because that's quite important. Do you see sort of interest in studying North Korea from the perspective of South Koreans, especially the young generation? Because I think that's quite important. What I know is what I study, or what I know is what I hear from the media. And that's a quite big difference. So how do you see, maybe from your friends, maybe you have some friends, scholars in the South Korea, is there interest from the young generation to study more deeply North Korea and the society of the North Korea?
I don't, right. Just I left the South Korea almost 4 years ago. But from time to time, I revisit South Korea for my research, for my family reunion there. But I just heard from some South Korean scholars who are teaching South Korean students at the college. So they told me that uh, obviously the young generation's college students interested in North Korean society and North Korean people and North Korean regime and whatever decreased significantly, and their interest level has been decreasing gradually of the past decade. So, I mean, right, as we know, the South Korean society is economically well developed and one of very advanced countries, and culturally, just the South Korea is like having big impact on the global societies with many just Korean dramas and Korean K-pops and movies and everything. So there is a very little like motivation and incentives for South Korean young generations to have interest in North Korean society. Always just their perception is that North Korea tried to conduct nuclear tests and conduct missile firing tests and all those things. It's a very burdensome and annoying neighbor to them. So it's a very negative kind of pattern we are witnessing in terms of future prospect of peaceful unification between two Koreas.
As we know, between South and North Korea, there is a special zone. We call it the DMZ. And I have two questions about this, and you can decide how you're going to answer. The first one is that as the difficult times that we are experiencing now, they provide sort of relatively good base for some escalation, maybe some incident, maybe some provocation. Someone will be paid to do something, and then the conflict can start, or some sort of conflict can evolve. And the second question is about the role of the United Nations Command, which is playing in that mitigating that risk of the military escalation along the DMZ.
Yeah, always the unintended escalation of tensions and military conflict alongside with DMZ. Also in the West Sea area, we call it like a Northern Limit Line, NLL. So that's a dividing North Korean Sea and South Korean Sea. So there have been the danger alongside with DMZ and NLL of long period of times. So recently, I think one of the most practical or the real possibility might be just as we know, the South Korean like a military or intelligence command or that was not that certified, but the South Korea deployed one drones, flew drones to sky of Pyongyang, and then the distributed anti-Pyongyang, anti-North Korea leaflets within the Pyongyang in the center of North Korean regime, so that I think the North Korean the leaders, they were so annoyed and infuriated with that South Korean action. So if that happened again, they warned that they would take military actions or aggressive actions toward South Korea. So I think in the process, obviously, if South Korea deployed or flew another or other drones to North Korean skies, and if North Korean the soldiers and forces detected them, and then they just fired them, fire artilleries or whatever to shoot them down, and they can spark the military kind of actions there. And also, as we know, of the past, I think 1 year or of the 6 months, North Korea sent so-called trash balloons to South Korea very often, even more than 20 times and 30 times they have been doing that. So I think the government and South Korean people were angered with those actions. So so far it didn't happen, but the South Korean military, right, when they detect those balloons around the DMZ area, whatever, they can shoot them down as well. So that can create unintended military kind of skirmishes and conflicts on that area. So even just the NLL, on the NLL line, that's a very dangerous component. In 2010, we witnessed Yeonpyeong shellings, right? North Korean forces, they fired artilleries and shells on the Yeonpyeong Island. So 2 soldiers and 2 civilian people were killed and others injured. And that, at the time, 2 Koreas were on the brink of war. Without the Obama administration's intervention, probably South Korean president at the time, the Myung-Bak Lee, just could have retaliated against that action using the jet fighters and all those things. So it was very dangerous situation on NLL as well. So the South Korean military, South Korean government considers NLL, Northern Limit Line, as official border on the sea between 2 Koreas. But North Korea does not accept that. So that it's very disputable between those 2 nations. Anytime the military actions can take place on NLL area. That's, I think, more dangerous than the DMZ area at this point. Yeah, United Nations Command, as far as I know, I think it has a very limited role just in preventing those things from happening. I think just the United Nations Command can encourage both North Korea and South Korea to resolve those issues with the negotiations and peaceful dialogues and all those things. But again, they don't have just the final authority to dictate both nations, the policy making and all those things. So in the South Korean case, I mean, obviously, U.S. forces, right? U.S. forces in South Korean soil, they have the final kind of authority to dictate all those unfoldings. So UN command has, I think, limited role.
The next question is about the balance. And that's, we hear about North Korea developing new weapons and South Korea maybe acquiring new weapons, including the nuclear weapons. So how would you see South Korea as a balanced power, as a diplomatic effort of the South Korea to respond to those events in the North Korea?
Yes, that's a very important and the intriguing question. So, long story short, at this point, I feel just considering all those external factors and internal factors, it's really hard for the South Korean government to do something. So what I'm saying is that the Russia and North Korea security cooperation, military cooperation, that's happening. So South Korea cannot just prevent that from happening. So just the South Korean government and people, they are witnessing. Just the only thing South Korea can do is that whether or not they provide more offensive weapons to Ukraine to annoy Russia or to retaliate Russia, or just what else the South Korea can do? I mean, just in conjunction with the United States and Japan and NATO nations, right? Definitely, South Korea has been heavily or harshly criticizing the North Korean regime, sending its military forces to the Ukrainian front and Russia as well. So, diplomatically, right? Economically, obviously, the South Korea has been involving in the anti-Russia, the sanction regimes. So, but in practical terms, anyway, that's North Korea's decision and Russia's decision. Russia is one of the big powers in global politics. So in practical terms, what can South Korea do? So I think it's very just limited, especially considering this is external factors, but looking at the internal factors within South Korean society, as we know, the Yoon Suk-yeol government is very conservative. Since the May 2022, when the President Yoon took the office, his policy toward North Korea has been pretty harsh and hardline policies. So at this point, I mean, it's really hard for him and his government to change its policy course dramatically vis-a-vis North Korea. So I think the very inflexible policy kind of lines Yoon Suk-yeol has been taking. So what I'm saying is considering the both internal and external factors. So it's a really just difficult for South Korea to change the scene. And just what South Korea can do is that the South Korean government, Yoon Suk-yeol government, continue to strengthen its trilateral, right? U.S., Japan, South Korea trilateral security cooperation and military cooperation to deter North Korea from taking the further military actions or raising tensions on the Korean Peninsula. So other than that, what South Korea can do to change the course of actions the North Korea and Russia are taking right now?
Do you think that if South Korea acquired nuclear weapons, would this change anything?
Yeah, this is a very good question and big question. So within South Korean society of the past 2 to 3 years, especially, the big debate has been going on. So South Korea also needs to have nuclear weapons to make balance, to strike a balance vis-a-vis the North Korea. But as we know, even just more than 70% of South Korean public, they support South Korean nuclearization measure. But as we know, under the nuclear non-proliferation regime and system, undergirded by the United States and other big powers, UK and France and Russia and China, and all like a international community. So it's really difficult for South Korea to pursue its own nuclear armament. So if that happens without U.S. sanctions, without U.S. approval, I think it creates havocs in South Korean economy, and international sanctions will ensue. And so it's a really difficult situation to do that. So, right, at this point, as I mentioned, South Korean current government, Yoon Suk-yeol government, heavily relies on the extended deterrence nuclear umbrella provided by the United States. So Biden administration has been confirming that and strengthening the measures and continually. So yeah, still debates are going on within society, South Korean society, but in practical terms, it's really hard for South Korea to pursue nuclear armament. But I think there should be one caveat. If America, right? If America, if just the Trump were re-elected as a president, and then President Trump tried to withdraw South Korean U.S. forces from South Korea, or heavily request the South Korean government to raise its expenses for U.S. forces stationed on South Korea, or if those kinds of things happens, probably the South Korean public opinion in terms of South Korea's its own nuclear armament will increase or will be strengthened further and further. So that kind of condition might happen later on. But under current situations, I think America's provision of extra like a just the nuclear umbrella is just the status quo, and continuation of that measure might be the practical one.
How do you see the North Korea in involvement with Russia? We know that North Korea is strengthening ties with Russia, and also there are some increased nuclear activities, maybe some cooperation regarding the satellites, using Russian space program to get the satellites to the orbit. So what's your opinion and how this cooperation is going at the moment?
Yeah, I think that's the $1 million question. again, we need to understand some historical context, the recent historical context. So in 2018 and 2019, as we witnessed, the North Korea had a strong desire to have diplomatic settlement with the United States with respect to the North Korean nuclear weapons. So the Kim Jong-un desperately needed to have sanction relief. So over a long period of time, as we know, North Korea suffered from economic crisis. And so without America's support, without the diplomatic normalization with the United States, North Korea has had a very difficult condition to rejuvenate its lackluster economy. So as we know, for instance, the U.S. has a big power and authority in international organizations such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. So as a third world country and underdeveloped nations, North Korea has desperately needed those external loans provided by the international organizations. But because of America's the denial, and so North Korea couldn't have any loans from the international organizations. So that's one example why North Korea has not rejuvenated its economy over a long period of time. So up until 2018, 2019, I believe that the Kim Jong-un had a strong desire to make a diplomatic settlement with the United States, and then there can be a big stepping stone on which North Korea can develop its economy. So that was, I think, the Kim Jong-un's one of the most important policy goals. But that didn't happen. That ended up with a very humiliating ending of Trump-Kim Hanoi summit. So, so that as I mentioned, until February 2022, Kim Jong-un had some kind of a remaining thought and desire to return to negotiating table. But after Russia invaded Ukraine, I think that because of big, tremendous geopolitical changes, I think North Korea, I believe, the Kim Jong-un decided to side with Russia as well as the China, and so that it tried to maintain its dictatorship, and it tried to just relieve its economic difficulties with the support from the Russia, especially at this point. So returning to your question, right, by deploying North Korean troops to the Ukrainian front for Russia's war effort, also it has been reported that the North Korea sent the millions of artillery shells, but old-fashioned, right? The artillery shells to Russia for Russia's war effort in Ukraine. So obviously, North Korea's mindset, North Korea is aimed at gaining economic support from Russia, especially. Obviously, the Russia produces a lot of oils and natural gases. So as we know, North Korea suffer from the lack of those natural resources, so that Russia can provide those the oil resources and natural gases in exchange for North Korea's military support. Also, as you mentioned, in terms of North Korea's nuclear development, especially the missile development, so North Korea needed to master ICBM technology. But one remaining piece North Korea has to master is that so-called the technology of re-entry vehicle, the ICBMs. So I think when ICBM go out of the atmosphere and then come into atmosphere, it has to endure a strong vibration and extreme heat. So North Korea has not conducted that test yet, could not do that. So in order for North Korea to convince the United States of North Korea's the capability to hit the U.S. mainland with a nuclear-tipped intercontinental ballistic missiles, North Korea must master that technology. So I think in return for North Korea's support for Russian war effort in Ukraine at this point, I think one of the key goals Kim Jong-un has in his mind is that to ultimately get that kind of technology from Russia. I think that can be a game changer in terms of North Korea's nuclear missile development, also in terms of gaining the recognition as a de facto nuclear power from the Western societies.
I think this might be to some extent a goal of North Korea, because once you have nuclear weapons, you have completely different position in international affairs. So that's quite that gives a strong logic as how the development is going at the moment. So do you think if North Korea is going to master and improve the nuclear technologies, and they will say, oh, now we have nuclear weapons, and this game changer, as you call it, what might be the implication for the South Korea? Is there even a limited something that South Korea can do about it?
There must be a few options South Korea can take vis-a-vis North Korea's continual nuclear and missile development. So first option would be the current kind of policy measure. South Korea continue to rely on America's provision of the nuclear umbrella. So that's, I think, very practical and the status quo policy measures and very feasible ones for the foreseeable future. The second option is that, as I mentioned, South Korea is nuclear. But long story short, because of NPT system, because of the opposition of the United States and many other international community, even China and Russia, to that, that's technically really difficult issues. Even another option is that the many scholars and pundits, they think that, or they argue that the US can redeploy its tactical nuclear weapons to South Korean soil. As many of you might know, since 1958, between 1958 and 1991, US deployed its own tactical nuclear weapons on South Korean soil. So at the peak time, more than 900 the US tactical nuclear weapons were deployed on South Korean soil. But in 1991, under senior Bush administration, all those weapons were withdrawn from South Korea. So what I'm saying is America's official policy right now is not to deploy those tactical nuclear weapons to South Korea again. So again, it's really difficult to facilitate that. So at this point, what can South Korean government and South Korean society can do? Again, so the strengthening of US, Japan, and South Korea triangular security and military cooperation, that has been just a very important source of deterrence against North Korea. So I think the conservative government in South Korea, but the progressive side within South Korea, they argue that the South Korean government needs to be more flexible rather than just relying on US and Japan. Even nowadays, the NATO allies, South Korea needs to have a more flexible approach to China, flexible approach to Russia, even to North Korea. So to incentivize North Korea to come to the negotiating table. But that's also, I think, a really unfeasible kind of argument, at least at this point.
We mentioned South Korea, the United States, and other countries, but still, do we know what is the opinion of China if North Korea is going to acquire nuclear weapons? What would that mean for China?
Yeah, as we know, in 2006, North Korea conducted the first nuclear test. And since that time on, North Korea has conducted 6 nuclear weapon tests. So, right, the North Korea is not nuclear power in terms of legal sense. So on the NPT system and international community would not consider North Korea as de jure legal nuclear power. But in practical terms, North Korea is already nuclear power. So according to scholars and the pundits, it is reported that North Korea contains more than 60 nuclear warheads at this point. So obviously, when we look at the China's stance on that, China does not want North Korea to be de facto nuclear power. But again, realistically, it is very limited for China to change North Korea's policy course at this point because North Korea is already nuclear power. And so, especially under growing and intensifying US-China strategic rivalry, I think the strategic value of North Korea is really big to China. So I think China needs to keep North Korean regime afloat so that as we know, the China has not been very active in imposing the international sanctions on North Korea. So I think it's a really just a difficult and extremely hard for international community to reshape this North Korea's nuclear armament and this direction.
If we add the war in Ukraine into this and Russia and China as two partners, basically in military cooperation, that creates a tremendous triangle or even the situation that is very complex. And I think it requires sort of nuanced approach so we understand the situation much better in terms of geopolitics and international security. There is also one organization in Indo-Pacific, ASEAN. How do you see the role of, for instance, this regional organization in helping South Korea to deter the North Korea, or basically the role of ASEAN in all these international security questions coming or around the North and South Koreas?
So shortly speaking, I think I don't believe ASEAN has any leverage toward North Korean issues and Korean Peninsula issues. So one thing I can talk about is that the so-called ASEAN Regional Forum, ARF. So over a long period of time, even US and Indo-Pacific nations, including North Korea and South Korea, China, many nations regularly gathered together in one just a nation of those ASEAN countries. So they exchanged views and they talk about the North Korea's nuclear issues and many other issues there. But the big criticism with respect to ASEAN Regional Forum is that that's just a talk shop. It doesn't have any enforcement mechanism to restrain North Korean behavior, provocative behavior. It doesn't have any teeth to change North Korea's course of actions. So, I mean, long story short, the ASEAN does not have the meaningful leverage toward Korean Peninsula, especially North Korean issues.
Right. I think that's quite important because when you research the Indo-Pacific region, you're trying to find those security arrangements. And the latest development of this is related to United States deploying strategic assets in the Indo-Pacific. And now with the new prime minister in Japan, there are sort of rumors about creating or involving countries in the Indo-Pacific in NATO. And that would be a different level of the organization comparing to ASEAN. So how do you see those latest developments regarding NATO, maybe enlarging NATO, maybe including Asian countries in NATO, or even creating sort of NATO style or NATO-based organization in Indo-Pacific?
As far as I know, already, I think NATO plus IP4, those terms are used by scholars and the policymakers. The NATO members plus Indo-Pacific four powers, right, including the South Korea, Japan, Australia, probably New Zealand. So I think one big debate is going on with respect to that aspect. So during Cold War period, even just until recently, the NATO was NATO, and obviously NATO was main focus was to deter the Russian aggression toward the European nations. But in terms of Indo-Pacific area, as we know, America's main the military and security policy focus was to maintain and strengthen U.S. alliance system with the South Korea, Japan, the Australia, and the Philippines, and many of those individual kind of alliance system was the focus until recently. But especially the in since 2000, in May 2022, when the South Korean conservative president Yoon Suk-yeol took office, I think his policy was dramatically different from the previous the South Korean government, so that he made every effort to strengthen South Korean ties with Japan and the U.S., even just the NATO nations. So big debate is that will be helpful for the South Korean security to a certain extent, right? I think if some military conflicts took place on the Korean Peninsula, I think NATO, the countries, can provide some kind of military equipment and even political support, diplomatic support, even just military support as well. But on the other hand, I think that kind of strengthening of NATO and IP4 nations in the Pacific, I think that can unnecessarily irritate China and the Russia, especially in this context like China. I mean, China is so sensitive to that kind of anti-China coalition, the unfolding within the Asia Pacific regions. So what I'm saying is, on the other hand, that strengthening of NATO and IP4 ties can unnecessarily just irritate China and then destabilize the geopolitical stability in Asia Pacific region. So, but from the South Korean perspective, I think at least from the Yoon Suk-yeol government's perspective, so it would be helpful for South Korea to strengthen its ties with the NATO members, because if something, just the military tensions and conflicts took place on the Korean Peninsula, the South Korea could have the strong kind of the economic and diplomatic, even just the military support from the NATO countries. So I'm quite ambivalent with that measures. I mean, from the South Korean perspective, not only from just the South Korean governmental perspective, from the South Korean nation's perspective, China is a quite important nation in terms of its economic just development, economic growth. China is the #1 trading partner. Also, the South Korea needs to unify the nation, right? With North Korea in a peaceful manner, like long-term perspective. In that effort, China is an indispensable partner to achieve that. So I think to put China on the kind of adversary seat would be really I think negative to South Korean interest in the long-term perspective.
Do you think that what is going on in North Korea and the whole East Asian geopolitics, that in terms of international security, Japan and South Korea, are they getting closer?
That's a big debate, Martin. If you closely look at the South Korean society, in terms of strengthening the ties between Japan and South Korea over the past 2 to 3 years. So again, the current Yoon Suk-yeol government pushed for the mending the fence with Japan in terms of historical dispute. As we know, the Japan colonized Korea between 1910 and 1945, especially during the World War II period, the Japanese government and Japanese military violated human rights seriously vis-a-vis at the time, Korean people. So a lot of historical tensions, historical issues have been big impediment to Japan-South Korea relations of a long period of time. So that the Yoon Suk-yeol government just try to move on rather than addressing the forced labor issue, comfortable labor issues, and comfortable women issues, history textbook, Yasukuni Shrine issues. Let's move on. In response to North Korea's growing threat, even just a Chinese threat, Russian threat, the South Korean government, Yoon Suk-yeol government, has made every effort to strengthen its triangular relationship with the United States and Japan. So I think the one big aspect we need to keep in mind is that what's the next president? Who's next president in South Korea? So right now, I think the progressive side, Lee Jae-myung, the head of the Minjudang, Democratic Party in South Korea, he might be elected as a future, next president in South Korea. I think if that is the case, the South Korean policy towards Japan, South Korean policy toward North Korea and China would be dramatically changed. So I think my answer to that question is that depending on South Korean the political unfoldings, so future of Japan-South Korea relationship will be significantly changed.
Let's go to a little bit philosophical question in terms of international diplomacy and security. And this is the question that I receive from my students. Who has a leverage on North Korea and leaders in North Korea? Is there any country, organization, or maybe political figures that we can mention?
Yeah, who knows that question, right? Clearly or accurately. Just we needs to make like informed guess and speculation about that. But seemingly, I believe that Kim Jong-un and the military leaders and core political leaders who support Kim Jong-un, they, I think, consolidate. Especially Kim Jong-un is number one under North Korea's Suryong, right? A monolithic system within North Korea. So the Kim Jong-un and his followers, core followers, consolidated North Korean their power within North Korean society. So I believe Kim Jong-un has an ultimate authority within North Korean society. Obviously, I think military leaders, always Kim Jong-un should be concerned about some revolt from the top military leaders in the North Korean society. But as we know, since December 2011, when he took the power after his father's Kim Jong-il's death, I think of the past more than 10 years, he has been making every effort to purge potential challengers to his power and his status. So I think so many military leaders and political leaders, they have been purged, sometimes very brutally, right? As we know, his uncle, Jang Sung-taek, was brutally just killed by Kim Jong-un's order, probably, or just the anti Jang Sung-taek factions within North Korean society at that moment. So what I'm saying is that there must be a lot of kind of internal turmoils between power elites within North Korean society. But at least at this point, Kim Jong-un and his core supporters, they just have absolute power of North Korean society. But one thing I want to talk about is that even so, how North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un maintained his power. So, right, many dictators, they don't care about the general people's opinions and their living style or whatever. But ultimately, right, if the North Korean economic conditions continue to be in a crisis moment and so many North Korean public, they starve to death or they suffer from the lack of food and electricity and all those things. So eventually, the Kim Jong-un and his core supporters might face a strong kind of resistance and opposition from the North Korean public. So why the Kim Jong-un really wanted to relieve sanctions in 2018, 2019 summits with Trump. So yeah, that was an obvious fact. So to maintain his regime, Kim Jong-un needs to satisfy the North Korean people's kind of living standards or whatever, especially core groups, right? How can I say that? Like a core military leaders who are political and intelligence kind of supporters. I mean, about 1 million or whatever, 500,000 people who reside in Pyongyang or whatever. So the Kim Jong-un needs to feed them, needs to satisfy them. If they cannot do that, I mean, the dictatorship, North Korean regime cannot sustain. So because of that, the North Korea desperately needs to have economic development.
And when we move a level up internationally, can you see, for instance, President Putin or President Xi as influential leaders who might have a leverage on North Korean leader and maybe to mitigate some of those harsh narratives related to security?
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting question. From the Putin's perspective, obviously, the Russia needs North Korean military support at this point, as well as political and diplomatic support, since Russia has been seriously isolated in the international community. So that I think Russia, I believe that Russia has a little incentive to constrain North Korea's nuclear and missile development and all those things, at least at this point. If the Russia-Ukrainian war ended just in favor of Russia, so if that is the case, probably the value of the North Korea can be significantly decreased from the Putin's perspective. But as long as the war continues, as long as Russia suffers from the lack of materials and military soldiers, and so desperately Russia needs North Korea, so that the Russia doesn't care about the North Korea's nuclear and missile development much. So that's one thing. But on the other hand, China is slightly, I think, different. So as we see, even in 2016 and 17, when the international community, led by the US, tried to impose harsh sanctions on North Korea in response to North Korea's development of nuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missiles. So at the time, China just actively participating in creating harsh sanction regimes vis-a-vis North Korea. Even just the China agreed to pass the resolution stipulating that 90% of North Korean oil imports should be cut. So that's a very harsh measures toward North Korea. But at the end of the day, the China's ultimate goal is to maintain peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. China does not want kind of military conflict or unstable conditions caused by the North Korean nuclear and missile provocations and all those things. So that I think at this point, I mean, China is a little ambivalent. So as we see, China is tacitly support the Russian war efforts vis-a-vis Ukraine. So under that kind of context, also under intensifying U.S.-China strategic rivalry, right? Even though China does not want North Korea to further develop its nuclear and missile capabilities, but from the Chinese perspective, they do not want to impose harsh sanctions and just to constrain North Korean behavior too much, because North Korea's strategic value to China is also quite significant.
Right. The last question for today's interview. And that's the triangle: Russia, China, and North Korea. What do you think will be happening in terms of this constellation in the next, let's say, 1 or 3 years? Because we can't predict the future, but we maybe can work with some assumptions based on the facts we know.
Yeah, that's very important question. So personally, as a researcher and political scientist, I really want to know what's happening behind the scenes in terms of Russia, China, and North Korea triangular cooperations. So seemingly, as I mentioned, Russia and North Korea, they don't care about international opinions, international community. They do what they want to do right now. So despite all international pushbacks and everything, they don't care about that. Anyway, they are isolated nations and pariahs in the international community. Who cares? They need to survive. They need to win the war, and they need to get the just cutting edge technology to master North Korea's nuclear and missile capabilities. But in the case of China, it's different. At least so far, right? Seemingly, China tacitly support Russia, and China definitely just want to help the sustenance of North Korean regime. But the China cannot fully or cannot completely support North Korea and the Russia at this point because of the European nations, because of the United States, because of South Korea, Japan, and other Asian nations. As we know, the China is economically interdependent with many other nations all around the world. So China should not be isolated or stigmatized as a terrible nations helping the Russia and just the North Korea publicly. So I think that's one hope we have. So still China cares about international opinions, still cares about its a relationship with South Korea and Japan, the relationship with the United States. So China really want to continue to develop its economy. China want to get out of the current economic kind of downturns and economic slowdowns. So, but personally, what I really want to know is that behind the scene, what level of coordination between those three nations is happening? I mean, according to the newspaper articles and the media outlets, so seemingly China is uncomfortable and China just criticize or it's reserved or do not support North Korea's sending its troops to Ukrainian front for Russia. But my doubt is that without Chinese tacit support and approval, the North Korea can do its own action like that. I'm doubtful because anyhow, North Korea's trade dependence on China is absolute. Is recently more than the 95% of North Korea's trade that happens with China. So I really want to know that. I really want to know the intelligence, just classified information about it. But probably nobody knows in Western societies. So that's a very dangerous component. So to what extent those three nations are coordinating in their action at this point? Also, the one thing is that, as I mentioned, China is still, they are very caring about Western countries and South Korea and economic aspects and future economic development and all those issues. But if Chinese leaders feel that, oh my goodness, there's no hope in terms of Taiwan issues, the South China Sea, maritime disputes, and even domestic economic conditions. If China begin having no concerns about international opinions and everything, then just openly support Russia and North Korea or even Iran, that might be really concerning. I mean, that's all just entering to a very dangerous phase of the global politics.
Professor Yangmo Ku, many thanks for your insightful thoughts and experience as a political scientist that you shared with us regarding researching North and South Korea. I think this topic is fascinating to research. There are so many areas that we can research in depth, and we can get knowledge and wisdom by researching these two countries. So again, thank you very much for being on IR Thinker.
Thank you for having me.